Welcome to today's webinar, 2020, a year of challenges and opportunities for new Americans. If at any point during the presentation you have questions for our speakers, please add them into the question box on your screen. We will address them at the end of our presentation. We will share today's slide deck and all other materials after the webinar. Thank you for joining. We'll get started shortly. Welcome to today's webinar, 2020, a year of challenges and opportunities for new Americans. If at any point during the presentation you have questions for our speakers, please add them into the question box on your screen. We will address them at the end of our presentation. We will share today's slide deck and all other materials after the webinar. Thank you for joining. We'll get started shortly. Welcome to today's webinar, 2020, a year of challenges and opportunities for new Americans. If at any point during the presentation you have questions for our speakers, please add them into the question box on your screen. We will address them at the end of our presentation. We will share today's slide deck and all other materials after the webinar. Thank you for joining. We will get started shortly. Please welcome today's webinar monitor, NPNA Policy and Campaigns Manager, Diego Iñiguez Lopez.
Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar, 2020, a year of challenges and opportunities for new Americans. This is the first of multiple webinars that the National Partnership for New Americans, or NPNA, and partners will be holding as part of the New American Voters 2020 campaign. The campaign is a digital civic engagement effort that harnesses the collective power of the 41 NPNA member organizations and affiliates in this critical year to ensure that the voices of all naturalized citizens are heard at the polls. Naturalized citizens are now 1 in 10 eligible voters in the United States. This emerging voting bloc is multicultural, multiracial, majority women, and diverse in age. However, in this critical and historic year, it's not enough to naturalize. In 2020, we must vote. New American Voters 2020 is a campaign that will engage the newly naturalized in upcoming elections through the NPNA network and also through the networks of our growing cohort of national partner organizations. We launched this campaign in mid-June with two purposes. The first of which is to encourage the millions of newly naturalized citizens to vote this year. And secondly, to build the national narrative that newly naturalized citizens are a diverse and dynamic voting bloc, including in politically important states that should be addressed by political parties and elected officials. NPNA is proud to host today's conversation with the Fair Immigration Reform Movement, or FIRM, the Florida Immigrant Coalition, or FLIC, and the League of Women Voters. We'll dive right into our presentation. To kick things off, I'd like to welcome the Executive Director of NPNA, Nicole Melacu.
Thank you, Diego. We are so excited to be here with you today and with our partners to launch the New American Voters 2020 campaign webinar series, the New Americans Guide to the Polls. We really want to ground and center this conversation today as we head into a historic election season and really talk about the ways that we can address the challenges ahead for 2020 build our collective impact, and meet this opportunity to engage immigrant voters on the newly naturalized this cycle. As Diego mentioned, majority of these newly naturalized immigrant voters, almost 55%, are women, so we're pleased to be joined by the League of Women Voters, and we'll hear from a critical state in this cycle, Florida, around what's on the table for immigrant voters. I don't need to tell you the challenges that our immigrant and refugee communities have faced over the last 3.5 years. We've endured over 400 different anti-immigrant attacks from this administration through executive order, administrative, and memorandums. From the Muslim ban, harmful enforcement policies, the public charge ruling, and on, the attacks of current pathways to adjust status in our communities are just countless harms to name. We know that our families have been hardest hit by COVID-19, and Congress's continued lack of action on relief for immigrant families makes our work all the more urgent. For many NPNA members who provide frontline legal services, we are deeply concerned about the attacks on citizenship. From the recently published fee rule increase that will price out low-income immigrants from accessing naturalization, adjustment of status through green cards, and other vital adjustment processes, we see that working class and lower-income immigrants are being shut out, priced out of citizenship. We have advocated for years as a network, and along with many of our members across the firm network as well, to counter the excessive backlogs. And now with COVID, the delays in oath ceremonies are essentially another desperate attempt to suppress the inclusion and civic engagement of aspiring Americans. Despite these challenges and the onslaught of ongoing immigrant attacks, nearly 5 million new Americans have naturalized in the last several years, and in response to the anti-immigrant rhetoric, have wished to secure their status, protect their families, and have a voice in our civic process as we head into November. As we look at this slide deck now, you can see that the numbers of new Americans are astounding. The number of immigrant voters will be astounding in 2020, and you will see that we are nearly 10% of the electorate. And beyond the current beltway cities that we've typically seen large number of immigrant populations in gateway cities rather, you will see that many of the places that we will be talking about today include the Rust Belt, the South, the Southwest, and outside of the traditional port of entry. As campaign partners, we have the unique opportunity to align our efforts, educate voters on how to safely engage in this election, to support our members, allies, and partners on the different processes that we'll be using to turn out in the challenging year that 2020 presents. Vote by mail strategies, absentee ballots are absolutely critical for us to turn out the immigrant and the newly naturalized vote. We also will learn to identify and report voter intimidation tactics so that our communities have the resources they need to make their voice heard this November. Across the network and beyond traditional gateway cities, we know that immigrant voters will play an important role in shaping the future of this country. So today, we are going to combine our collective power and hear from our network partners who have powerful messages on what they are doing in their networks and across the country to turn out the immigrant and the newly naturalized vote.
Thank you, Nicole. Our next speaker is Zulma Arias, the Director of Immigration and Power Building for Community Change, which houses FIRM and Community Change Action. Prior to joining Community Change, Zulma was the Executive Director for Sunflower Community Action in Kansas, a multiracial grassroots organization that worked on issues of racial and economic inequality and immigrant justice. Under her leadership, a coalition of local and national organizations attempted to defeat Chris Kobach as he ran for Secretary of State in Kansas. He is no longer Secretary of State and was recently defeated in the Senate primary. In 2018, the New York Times editorial board noted that Kobach represents the ugliest part of today's Republican Party. Zulma's leadership and compassion for immigrant communities is rooted in the story of her own migration from El Salvador at 12 years old with her niece and nephews, ages 3 and 5, and her journey towards becoming a new American. Please welcome Zulma Arias.
Thank you, Diego. And first of all, I want to start out by saying a big congratulations to NPNA for this moment, for this incredible moment, and to the many partners who long ago had the incredible wisdom of starting the NPNA network and the FIRM network to really pull the power of our communities together to achieve the power that we need to win for our communities. So congratulations to all of you for your work. I'm going to talk for a little bit about just diving a little bit into the challenges that we're facing, and then to talk a little bit about the opportunities. Nicole touched on some of the challenges and some of the opportunities, but we often refer to this moment as, people talk about, the triple crisis. I would say that, the three areas represent a number of challenges and crises that this country is facing, and it could be like many, many more, right? But I think the three that I wanna dive into in this moment kind of represent the three big categories that are represent the biggest challenges for the work that we want to move forward. First and foremost, I mean, we have been experiencing this now for the last 4 to 5 months. We are in a pandemic that represents not only a challenge that has shaken not only our organizations, our institutions, but the entire world and everything that we know, right? The United States is now the #1 country with the highest infections in the world. We are way into our, what they saw coming a few months ago, a second wave, and we are now facing a challenge as we think about how we're going to build power for our communities. The challenge that keeps us physically away from each other, which is, us if we didn't have challenges before, the challenges of our community being called essential workers, yet being treated as disposable and still having to be out there doing the essential work that that this country needs in order to be able to keep going. So that's a pandemic like nothing any of us had ever experienced in our lifetime. That is the level of, the #1 challenge that we have at this moment, right? Second to that, we are, as a result of many policies, but specifically as a result of this pandemic that we are in, we are faced with an enormous economic challenge, which I would say is the second crisis that this country is facing. As a country, the unemployment rate is the highest that it's been. I mean, it's at this point is like there's out there we have about over 50 million people who are unemployed, and specifically for our undocumented and immigrant communities. What that means in a pandemic world, and as Congress talks about whether our communities deserve COVID-19 relief, which is the conversation happening in this country right now, our communities are even more affected economically due to the fact that we are not covered by the relief that the country or that Congress is providing to our communities. So what that's meant is that the incredible work that our organizations have had to do at the state level and that we're still pushing at the national level means that it's created extra work for us and for our organizations to make sure that we find other ways for our communities to make ends meet, meaning that whether that's state efforts where that economic help is coming, or just, basic grassroots, how do we help each other, right? And how do we remember that we're still a community, but tremendous economic challenges that we're facing as a country, as a community. And thirdly, I would say that, another pandemic, the pandemic that has been part of this country for many years, that has been fought before by being led by our African American community, but it's the pandemic of racial injustice and inequality, and the inequality that has been exposed as part of this pandemic but also most recently by the killing of men and women, African American men and women, that took a centerfold because of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, but also, it also reflects a fight that we thought had been fought for, right, with the civil rights movement, and yet we see that it's pretty much alive and well in this country, and that we as a community of color, together with our African American brothers and sisters, will still need to address and pick up. So those, I would say, represent the three big challenges that we are faced with, just to give you a snapshot of what we're facing. But I want to switch really quick to the opportunity. And Nicole, again, named some of the opportunities that we have. This space, this conversation being a window into that. And as I talk about, the inequality, the racial injustice, this moment in this pandemic and this health crisis that affects all of us, there's still an opportunity, and we know how to recognize as resilient communities that we are, and we know how to identify opportunities. And this is the moment that really calls for our leadership, for our creativity, and for our leadership in so many ways, because the opportunities very, right in front of us is some of the numbers that we see. The voting bloc that we represent as immigrant Latinx communities, AAPI communities, one of the most powerful voting blocs that will be organized to build the power that we need, and all of that. Not only that, but what the 10% of the naturalized vote that is still out there that we have to go and get and make sure that we plug in into this moment. I will also say that this moment of racial inequality is also providing an opportunity for us to connect to a fight that we all need to be picking up and having in this moment, which is the opportunity to create strong alliances with the African American community and to the fight that unites us, and that at the end of the day, we must have together in order to achieve real change and real justice in this country. Because the symptoms that we see not being included in COVID relief, being treated as indisposable or disposable workers, it's all part of the injustice and inequality that we're living. And for that to go away, we're going to have to tackle it together. So that represents another opportunity for us to fight back the nativist sentiment that's still very much alive in this country, and that the more that we unite and the more that our communities are empowered, the bigger they seem to get. But again, I want to say that the opportunity is at this moment is for us to really remind this country what we still have to do in order to create a more just nation. And we are the voice that keeps reminding this nation over and over that that work is still not done. And we have an opportunity at this moment to lead with our voices, to lead with our votes, to lead with our partnerships with communities that are calling for an end to all the injustices and to do it together. And that is probably the greatest opportunity that we have and that we must take in this moment. And at the end of the day, we have the opportunity to be the moral voice of this country. And that is something that we do now. We do it in the face of oppression. We do it in the face of constant pushback. And our communities being left out of census, our communities being left out of, a continuation of DACA. But we have the opportunity to be the moral conscience of this nation and to show up at the polls in November, and collectively as networks working with our C4 partners, Community Change Action and Firm Action, we will be mobilizing just as part of our congressional district strategy, over 400 million voters from our communities, and we'll invest millions and millions of dollars in turning out the vote. And get this, just to close, most of the work that we're going to be doing is being led in communities by women of color, most of them Latinas, but many immigrant communities where we are leading, and those are the people that will be moving and mobilizing our vote. And I'm sorry, I meant to say 4 million, 400 million, yeah, that's a little, take off 2 zeros. 4 million voters that will be moving just through our congressional strategy and investing over $10 million in those communities in order to organize the vote. So again, the opportunities are there. Let's stay focused. Let's stay focused on the opportunity and the power that we have to really show up as communities to get the justice that we deserve. Again, thank you to NPNA, and thanks to all of you for this opportunity. Back to you, Diego.
Thank you, Zulma. Next, we're going to hear from Adriana Rivera, Communications Director for the Florida Immigrant Coalition. Adriana is a native of Puerto Rico and has a BA in Communications from the University of Puerto Rico. She has lived in the private and nonprofit sectors, bringing forward her knowledge of marketing strategies. She excels in digital marketing and has a passion for social justice, especially when it concerns disadvantaged communities, disparities, and inequities. In her spare time, she likes to teach her skills to others and is passionate about traveling, world cultures, and genealogy. Adriana, welcome.
Hi, thank you for having me. Good afternoon to everyone. My name is Adriana Rivera, and I am the Communications Director with the Florida Immigrant Coalition. I am currently in South Florida in Miami, enjoying some nice weather today. So let's get into my presentation. So first of all, here in Florida, we're seeing a lot of challenges. I'm sure everybody knows with the skyrocketing COVID numbers, not only in cases, but also in deaths. Seems like every day we are setting a new record. And unfortunately, the communities that are the most heavily impacted are the communities that are the most vulnerable. The immigrants of color and essential workers are being very hardly hit. We have a lot of essential workers. We have a lot of farm workers as well here in Florida. A lot of the citrus, a lot of the vegetables that are sent all over the country are farmed here in Florida. And most of the farm workers are here with special farm worker permits. So also the lack of access to healthcare for these communities, the lack of protective gear that they've been getting in the field when it comes to particularly farm workers, face masks, any type of PPE is just not there for the most part. Also, frontline workers when it comes to, grocery stores or food service industry, there's also a lack of protective gear and a lack of access to health care that these people have. So our immigrant community here in Florida has seen huge spikes in coronavirus cases due to all of these variables. We have also seen a very strong, divisive, anti-immigrant rhetoric, and it's being used all the way from the top, specifically in Florida from our governor, Ron DeSantis. This pandemic is being used to vilify our immigrant community here. Our immigrant community and our frontline community, whatever the status may be, because we have a lot of mixed status families that are frontline families, are frontline workers, farm workers. They're being scapegoated for what's happening in the state at large. So we see that these farm workers are creating billions of dollars in revenue for the state. Unfortunately, it is the same state that sees them as disposable. They're not good enough to be given driver's licenses. They're not good enough to be given health care or PPE in order to do their jobs, yet they're bringing in so much wealth for this state. We have Governor DeSantis using the terms such as overwhelmingly Hispanic to describe who is to blame for the outbreak. And this blanket term is detrimental not only to specific workers or specific people with specific statuses, but it's also detrimental to the Hispanic community as a whole. We are being seen and we are being pointed to and scapegoated as the people who are transmitting this virus throughout the whole state. So that puts a target on all of our communities, from children to the elderly. So the opportunities that we do see in Florida is that we have a very big growing New American electorate in the state. Since the rise of anti-immigrant rhetoric and policies, we have seen an increase in citizens by nearly half a million. Since the fiscal year 2014 to 2015, 415,468 people have naturalized in the state of Florida. And the top 5 countries of those naturalizations are Cuba with 117,000, then Haiti with 33,000, Colombia 32,000, Jamaica 21,000, and Venezuela with 19,000. This is a really big pool of new voters, but knowing that new Americans are not a monolith, we do have to take into consideration the fact that a lot of these new voters will not necessarily be voting with us in the issues that we care about. So a lot of these voters are coming in as conservative voters. This is true a lot of times for the case of Cuban voters and Venezuelan voters. So it is a lot of work that we have to do in the state where a lot of these voters are not necessarily progressive voters. However, we do have a new voter community that is coming in really strongly with more progressive values, although, again, not a monolith at all. That is the Puerto Rican community. Now, they are American citizens by birth. I should say we are, because I'm Puerto Rican myself. So we are U.S. citizens by birth, even being born in Puerto Rico. But we are not allowed to vote for federal elections until we physically come to one of the 50 states. We see that after Maria, we had about 50,000 that came in the immediate aftermath. That's in the first 2 months after Maria. Maria was in September 2017, and in the next 2 months we had about 50,000 Puerto Ricans that came to Florida. But there are estimates that as a whole, out of Maria, there's been about 300,000 Puerto Ricans that have come after Maria to Florida. And Puerto Rico loses about 55,000 people per year since 2010, of which I have to say I'm one of them, unfortunately. Battleground, and then this is something that we can definitely use to our advantage, because Puerto Rican voters are skewing more progressive than voters from, let's say, Venezuela, for example. And these are voters who don't have to go through the naturalization process. They are still new voters, though, because we have to, the education process and the information process of Puerto Rican voters is very long. And there's a population who has been told their entire lives that they cannot vote for president, they cannot vote for Senate, they cannot vote for the House. And yet, when they get here, as soon as they get here, we're expecting them to register and to know how this whole voting system in the United States works, when it's completely different than what we have back home, even including the parties. In Puerto Rico, we don't have the Republican and Democratic parties as you have them here. So it is a community that can vote right away. However, there's a lot of work that needs to happen in order to get that vote out. So as we've seen, Florida is a battleground state with changing and a very interesting demographics. Thank you.
Thank you, Adriana. Our next speaker is Alma Covetier. the National Organizing Director for the League of Women Voters. In this role, Alma is responsible for building and developing the grassroots power needed to defend, expand, and protect voting rights for all to achieve true democracy reform. Prior to joining the League in 2019, Alma was the Deputy Field Director for Immigration at Community Change, home of Firm. Earlier in her career, Alma served as Organizing Director of Workforce Development and Education at CASA, an organization at the forefront of the immigrant rights movement, representing nearly 100,000 members. Alma, welcome.
Thank you, Diego, and thank you, everyone. Very, very excited to be here. I feel like I am back at home, and in a way, I am just bringing the ladies with me. Next slide, please. So the League turned 100 years this past February 14, and our message this year is Women Power the Vote. We do this to recognize the contributions that women made and continue to make to grow our democracy, to highlight the work that still needs to be done because we are nowhere near done. The 19th Amendment took 70 years to come to reality. Think about that for a moment. 70 years. Many of the women that started that fight didn't live enough to be able to see it happen. Nothing was given to those women. That right was taken and fought for really hard. And even though the 19th Amendment represents the largest growth in our democracy for the past 100 years, it is by no means a perfect accomplishment. Black women were left out and couldn't exercise fully the right to vote until 1965 with the passing of the Voting Rights Act. More work needs to be done to make sure that our democracy is truly representative, and that includes continuing to expand the right to vote, protecting the rights of voters, and ending practices and institutions with its origin in racism, such as gerrymandering and the Electoral College. Next slide, please. So right now, the League has 750 local leagues. Actually, it's a little bit higher than that, in all 50 states and also in the territories of Hong Kong, the U.S. Virgin Islands, and D.C. And we count with a base of over 400,000 supporters. Right now, just like it was before, it is a nonpartisan organization that is volunteer-driven, and we work on the ground to register voters. In 2018, we reached about 10 million voters. Our plan this year is to reach 1 in 5 Americans. And these are some of the things that we're doing. We are setting up a rapid response process across 50 states and DC for this election year, working with the news media to quickly react to bad information, contacting millions of voters directly with the right information, working with thousands of community partners to make sure that most impacted communities, again, poor, Black and brown immigrant communities, have access to accurate information. And there's the example, and I know that we were talking about Florida just a moment ago. We are contacting 80,000 people with prior felony convictions to make sure that they have the right to register to vote. We currently are engaged in 53 lawsuits related to COVID voting changes. This graphic, let's just go to the next slide. This graphic speaks about itself, and we already know this. The voter turnout rate increased very sharply in 2018 across racial and ethnic groups. And we know that voting is a powerful tool for women to make their voices heard. The powerful voice that women have in a democracy cannot be underestimated. And we've seen a lot of meaningful reform because of the votes that women are casting. But when we talk about the strongest vote, African Americans are the most reliable voting bloc in the country, especially African American women. We're also seeing Latinas emerge as powerful voting bloc as well. What we learn is that the more we provide access and opportunity, the more that you see people's voices being heard. Think about this. If voting didn't give you that much power, then why are there all these efforts out there to take it away? This year, the Black women's vote is going to be very influential. But just to be very clear, the Black women vote has been important and significant since the days we started working on suffrage. It just hasn't been credited. Turnout numbers for Black women in the midterms went from 41% in 2014 to 57% in 2018. They are a powerful voice and a voice that is part of this country, and that is why the work of Black women, as they do around every single day, should be recognized. Now, when we're talking about Latinas, Latinas are the second largest and second fastest growing population of women of color in the United States. And when we talk about Asian American, Native American, and Pacific Islanders, they are the fastest growing and perhaps the most diverse racial demographic of women voters in the United States. They have roots in dozens of different countries and possess multitudes of cultural and socioeconomic backgrounds. When we layer COVID on top of that, we need to think about the role that women play in our society and our economy. As we heard other people speak, immigrant communities and communities of color are more severely impacted by this pandemic. In case of women, women are most of the essential workers and are also most of the caregivers in this country, not only for our own families and children, but in the case of immigrant communities and in the Latina community, of our own parents. So the likelihood that we have families that are at risk at home is very likely. So we are putting ourselves at risk while we're also risking our families. And this is why it is more important than ever that we uplift and support one another when we are still in moments like this fighting for the Equal Rights Act to be part of our Constitution. And in spite of all of this increased burden on us, we know that women will be a critical voting group in November, particularly Black women and immigrants. And in this year where we are carrying so much of the work and the weight, we are still running for office in record numbers. In other words, if you didn't hear me at the beginning, women power the vote, and we continue to power the vote, and we will continue to power the vote. Next slide. So one of the things that we need to do to be able to continue to power the vote is to be trusted messengers. We need to have the right information, and we need to spread the right information. The League has very long been a trusted source of objective and nonpartisan election information. Since 2006, actually, Vote 411 has served tens of millions of voters. We reach all 50 states, providing meticulously researched information from the local zip code level to the state and the federal level. And I am very happy to say, as you can see in the screen, if you are actually looking at a screen right now, that our site is also in Spanish. It's fully in Spanish right now for the first time this year. So it is, of course, in English and in Spanish, and hopefully more languages will come. But in this site, you can do everything that you need. You can register to vote, check your status, check about your absentee ballot, check any up-to-date changes on polling locations or times. If you want the most accurate information, this is where you need to be. And why does this matter? Because election rules differ from state by state, often changing from year to year, and sometimes even within the year, sometimes even within the week, as we have seen during times of COVID. Using vote411.org, voters can confirm their polling locations, check if ID is required, see what their personal ballot will look like. Confirming this information before heading to the polls saves voters time, and perhaps voters makes better and more informed decisions. Next slide. So to be a trusted messenger, you can do three things, right? You can promote Vote 411 as the place to get that trusted, up-to-date information and do direct outreach to actual individual voters. So you can call 10 family and friends to make sure that they check the registration status. You can start with that. And then you ask them to do the same with their own contacts. And share this on social media. Make sure that as deadlines are approaching in your community, do a single post. Did you request your absentee ballot? Here is the link. You can check your information here. Did you check your status? All these questions might seem trivial, but it is the repetition across the networks and across our connections that is going to make a difference and can make people pay attention. Next slide. You can also volunteer, of course, and all of you are members of very active organizations, but you can also be a volunteer with your local league. If you go to our website, you can find by zip code the league that is the closest to you, and that way you can participate in our election process as well by doing voter education and outreach, helping to get out the vote, help others to register to vote. And if you want to volunteer as a poll worker, use Power the Polls, which is also available through our website. Next slide. And if you need inspiration, we created this blog for you, 100 Days and 100 Ways to Get Ready for Election Day. We are much less than 100 days. I believe we're at 85 right now. So I challenge you, take a look and let me know how many of these you will be doing. Thank you very much, and let's continue to power the vote. Back to you, Diego.
Thank you so much, Alma, Adriana, Surma, and Nicole. Right now, we have finished the presentations, so we're going to go right into the question and answer period. And I'm going to answer the first two questions really briefly so that we can go and hear from the panelists. The first question is, what other topics will this webinar series cover? I'm glad you asked. We have at least 3 more webinars as part of this webinar series. They're all going to be on the next coming Tuesdays. They're going to be during the next Tuesdays at the same time. Next week, this webinar will be called Black Immigrants and America's Racial Reckoning. That's going to connect the Black Lives Matter uprising to the opportunity for Black immigrants and Black newly naturalized citizens to sway the outcome of elections in 2020. The week after that, Tuesday, August 25th, same time, we're going to have this webinar called Building the Naturalization to Voter Pipeline. So the vast majority of NPNA member organizations have legal services departments, and many of them have really interesting models on taking the newly naturalized citizens and then engaging them in civic engagement and mobilization and political organizing. So we're going to hear a little bit about those models during that webinar. And then on September 1st, we're going to have a webinar called Voting in the Era of COVID-19, Your Rights at the Poll and Vote by Mail, focusing on the on access to the ballot through mail-in and absentee ballots. Those will all be on Tuesdays at the same time. The second question is, do you expect litigation will occur to stop fee increases from going into effect? That question refers to a regulation to increase citizenship from $640 to $1,170, increase lawful permanent residency and associated forms, add a $50 fee for asylum applications, and increase fees across the board, as well as eliminate most fee waivers. The regulation was finalized earlier this month and will be effective October 2nd unless the courts stop it. We anticipate litigation. There are significant substantive legal weaknesses and procedural deficiencies in how the administration pushed the regulation through, and we are hopeful that the courts will step in. At the same time, we recognize that the courts are only one of multiple venues for struggle. Another venue is community education, so the need to encourage the millions of eligible immigrants to naturalize before the fee increases potentially take effect. And you could find a member on our newamericanvoters2020.org website. We have a map where you can identify where there is a legal services provider who's an NPNA member in your area, so that folks who are eligible and who are considering apply and who would otherwise be priced out could be connected with an NPNA member. Another venue is Congress. So NPNA member organizations are advocating before congressional leadership, key committees, and other congressional members, and demanding that any congressional funding for USCIS that is part of the next COVID bill includes strict conditions or guardrails to hold USCIS accountable, including halting the regulation to increase fees and eliminate most fee waivers. We strongly encourage all of the folks on this call, on this webinar today, to contact your senators and representatives and demand that they hold USCIS accountable through strict conditions. The situation is extremely fluid right now, so your voice needs to be heard. And now we're going to go to the third question that we've received, and that is, what is happening now to ensure that undocumented folks are included in the next stimulus? Can this be a way to motivate new Americans to get to the polls? And for that, I'm going to pass it off to Zulma.
Thank you, Diego. So I want to say, obviously, we're still in that fight, but I want to, start out with what community change and FIRM has been moving. So for the last 4 months, we've put together, the network and the leadership that, represents and moves the decisions of the campaign, decided back in March, right after we started seeing what was happening, that we were going to mount a campaign. The We Are a Central campaign is something that we launched back in early April with the idea of moving, 6 demands around immigrant and immigrant family inclusion. We were successful in the first part of that in the House with the HEROES Act. 4 out of our 6 demands made it into the HEROES Act. And as you all know, passed through the House in mid-May. It's been a huge effort, not only to make sure that the congressmen, representatives knew what our stories were, what our demands were, but it was very important for us to take up this fight in a way that our communities were engaged, in the way that we really presented a which side are you on moment. We've talked to Republicans, we've talked to Democrats, and we're still in this moment, and in this last, maybe 2 to 3 weeks that might be left of the process, making every push to make sure that we're having the conversations we need to have, that we stay strong with what our demands are for family inclusion, while also leveraging the power that we have through our C4 work and our electoral work in the states where we can make sure that we're holding people accountable in the polls. And our network, NPNA FIRM network, has shown up incredibly and has over and over shown that we can keep the conversations open, that we can make sure that they are listening and that they are moving. We still have a lot of work to do, and regardless of what happens in the negotiations over the next week or 2, we will continue to keep the conversation for what we need and what we deserve at the front and center, and continue to move the electoral work regardless of what happens, because we know that this fight is for the long haul, and all roads at this moment will lead us to November.
Thank you, Zulma. The next question is, what does unite mean in terms of Latinx communities? How does your organization address the common anti-Black sentiments within Latinx organizations, especially when trying to serve Black Latinx immigrants? What are some of the strategies you have that other organizations could use to actually and functionally support Black communities? Zulma, could you take this one?
Great. Yeah, I can start. Great question. First, I want to say that Community Change is a multiracial, multi-issue organization. We work on many issues. The Fair Immigration Reform Movement, FIRM, is only one of the issues that Community Change Action works with. To specifically answer the question about uniting, we believe as FIRM and the leadership of this network that, and as Community Change, that in this moment that we're in, we should support and be guided by the leadership of Black men and women who are who are the ones who should be leading in the voices of this movement, and that in places across the network where we can align forces, we are moving to doing that all across the board. One of the things that is, it's the fair to say in this conversation is that we have all seen the anti-Blackness that is so pervasive even now within in this moment, especially within immigrant communities. We're addressing that, we understand it, and there's no other way to deal with that issue than to deal with it head on. In the last 3-4 months, we have done. I mean, the firm NPNA network has shown up in incredible ways to really deal with this issue. We've done, on June 26th, we did topics around the anti-Blackness in our communities in a way that seeks to unite and heal the oppression and the damage that we have in the communities. We did a training that had 225 participants from across the network. We've done another training on colorism with 125 participants. And we're diving deep into the hard conversations that we need to have as a movement. So that is the work that we're doing internally as firm. I would say that the other thing that we need to address, to your question around how do we support Black communities and Black-led organizations, is that we have to let funders and those who support our work, that Black-led organizations must be funded. We cannot just call on Black organizations to show up and not fund them. We must, as immigrant rights organizations, we should also, as we talk to funders, demand that the leadership of Black organizations is well funded, so that we can do the work that needs to be done. We cannot starve organizations and then look to them to lead us when we haven't, when the funding hasn't been there. So those are some of the things that we're doing to make sure that we not only unite, but that we continue to strategically move forward solutions.
Thanks, Dee. I would like to jump in if I could. I think, as NPNA, I think we are very committed to having the racial justice analysis throughout our policy work. And so recently we've kind of taken a deep look at this framing and idea around new American dreams and how that in many ways has not been inclusive of the Black African or the Black diaspora. So for us, it's really important. And for us, centering this moment and the opportunities where we have a platform to elevate Black leadership, as Sulma said, we will take that opportunity to elevate this discussion. We see it as the arc of continuum of the struggle for civil rights and combat voter suppression, to combat racism in our communities. And so we are very committed as an organization to go on that journey as well, along with many of our members who overlap in the firm NPNA network. The other idea that is really surfacing is around the idea of finding that platform and then really developing more leadership within Black communities. And so when we look around to elevate Black leaders in our movement and in our work at the National Immigrant Integration Conference, for example, there's normally, a group of folks that are tasked with being the people, and I think it is our obligation, our duty, to extend and open those doors to new leaders who can really frame the conversation based on their lived experience and their leadership in their local communities. So we are really thrilled to have partners like Black Alliance for Just Immigration in our camp and in our network to be able to help us through this journey. And as we mentioned, the next webinar will be devoted to the struggle from the racial reckoning, moving from anti-Blackness to Black dignity, and to turning out and a newly naturalized Black voters across our network.
Thank you. So the next question that we have is, what are you doing to reach Puerto Ricans? They are technically not new citizens, but they kind of are. Adriana, would you like to take that question?
Yeah, sure. Puerto Ricans, we are very complicated. It's a complicated topic. We are U.S. citizens from birth, but coming here, we are new voters. We are definitely new voters. And like I said in my presentation, there's so much work that needs to be done around education, voter education. I mean, in Puerto Rico, you only vote once every 4 years. You don't have midterms. You don't have, there's people say there's an election every day in this country. In Puerto Rico, it's only once every 4 years. You go and you vote for everything. There's also a lot of positions here that you don't have in Puerto Rico. Like, we don't have a sheriff in Puerto Rico that you elect. We don't elect our school board members. There's just so many things, and not only to mention that the party system is completely different as well. So what we are doing is a lot of work around voter education. We've been doing a lot of listening sessions with Puerto Rican voters in different age groups and different demographic brackets around Florida to understand what their sentiment is to this upcoming election. We have learned many, many things from these listening sessions that we are putting into practice, but also sharing throughout the collective progressive movement space in Florida so that, everybody has access to this information and can use it in order to reach out to Puerto Rican voters in their own ways. So we're also partnering with a lot of Puerto Rican orgs. We have, through FLIC, we support, like a sister org, if you may, called La Mesa Boricua, which means the Puerto Rican table. And La Mesa Boricua is made up of a lot of other either nonprofits, they could be businesses, they could be Puerto Rican leaders, just Puerto Ricans that want a seat at the table. And through La Mesa, we do a lot of education work, we do a lot of engagement work. A lot of our GOTV as a whole is going to be targeting Puerto Ricans. And I know that a lot of other organizations in Florida, whether they have done Puerto Rican work in the past or not, are definitely going to be actively looking at engaging and getting out the Puerto Rican vote. I don't know if that answered your question, if there's anything else to follow up.
Oh, this is Alma. If I may jump in on that one. Do I have time?
Yes, please.
Okay, great. So I wanted to talk about this because I am Puerto Rican, and I also feel very strongly about this, having living in the United States since 1996. But in here, as we see a disconnection, right, between Puerto Ricans and the right to vote, and all that process that has been so very well laid out, there's the fact that in Puerto Rico, turnout is actually really high. It actually sees a decline once we come to the States because of this disconnection. Like, this process is not about us, and our voice is not as important here. And there's also the dynamic of a community that is coming to this country thinking that it will return. So the roots that tie you to place and make you connect to what's going on around you and want to be part of bettering your communities and this country, that is something that needs to be developed. I remember growing up and voting, and that first time of voting being a rite of passage. That all my family came with me because I was going to be voting for the first time. So that feeling, that sense of community around voting, when you go to a different country, and I think this is the same with any immigrant, not only with Puerto Rican, but it's gone, and that needs to be rebuilt. I am so glad to hear that there is a concerted effort to do that, and I hope that as part of this effort, we actually rekindle that culture, because we have it in us. Even as they feel, I mean, there is the music and the plena and the salsa and the songs that come out on the streets and the caravans to turn out people to vote. So let's tap into that we all have, and let's make sure that we are connected to our communities and empowered to vote in this country.
Thank you. And I will answer and wrap up with the last question, and that is, where do you access this voter information by race, ethnicity? We have looked for and asked for it here in Central Oregon and have found anything at the precinct, city, or county level. And so NPNA, when we launched the campaign, released the Power of Newly Naturalized Citizens in the 2020 Elections report. And in that report, we utilized American Community Survey research on the race, ethnicity, as well as the county of residence for newly naturalized citizens. And I suspect that it also has more comprehensive data around what the questioner is looking for. Going to wrap up by inviting you all to check out that report and visit our website at newamericanvoters2020.org, where you can find the report. You can find a digital toolkit, how to get in touch with our media team, and access downloadable videos and resource guides. And we also encourage you all to join the conversation on social media using the hashtag NewAmericanVoters2020. Thank you all for joining, and tune in next week, Tuesday, August 18th, same time, 2 p.m. Eastern, as we'll co-host an important conversation with the Black Alliance for Just Immigration titled Black Immigrants and America's Racial Reckoning. Thank you to all of the panelists, and thank you all for tuning in, and have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.